In this video, we'll discuss how to identify whether a given equation is a function or not. So to determine whether an equation is a function, your first option is you can picture the graph of the equation and then apply the vertical line test. Now, this technique varies in effectiveness depending on how much you know how to graph. If you're limited to only lines and quadratics, this isn't the technique to go with, but after you learn how to graph more equations, this can be a very effective technique. So our second option, if we don't know what the graph of an equation looks like, is we can solve the equation for y. If more than one value of y can be obtained for a given x, then the equation does not define y as a function of x. So let's take a look at our first example, 4x equals y squared. Now just looking at this, I don't know how to graph it, say, so I'm going to use the second technique and solve the equation for y. To solve the equation for y, we need to get rid of the squared. So we'll apply our square root property and take the square root of both sides. On the right, the square and square root cancel out and leave us with just y, but on the left, because we applied the square root property, plus or minus emerges. So we end up with y is equal to plus or minus the square root of 4x. Now, I'm not really worried about simplifying that radical because the purpose of this is just to determine whether or not it's a function. And since we got this plus or minus here, that means that we got more than one answer for y. Therefore, this is not a function. Let's take a look at our next example. X plus y to the third equals 27. We're going to solve this equation for y. So first we'll subtract x from both sides, leaving us with y to the third equals 27 minus x. And then to eliminate that exponent of 3, we're going to take the cube root of both sides. On the left, the cube and the cube root cancel out, leaving us with just y. And on the right, because we're taking the cube root of both sides, not the square root of both sides, a plus or minus doesn't show up. A plus or minus only shows up with square root property. So this is going to be equal to the cube root of 27 minus x. And since we got just a single answer for y, this means that this is a function. Right, last example, y minus 3 equals 2 times the absolute value of x. To solve this equation for y, all we need to do is add 3 to both sides. We get y equals 2 times the absolute value of x plus 3. We only got a single answer for y, therefore, this is a function. Now, sometimes I find that students don't think that this should be a function. They feel like two answers emerge because they know when they solve a square root and absolute value equation that you get two answers. But we're solving for y, and y is not inside the absolute value bars. If we were to be solving for x, we would end up with two answers. But because we're solving for y, which is not inside the absolute values, we get just this single answer, making y equals 2 times the absolute value of x plus 3 a function.